Hi, this is a brief report on the 4th World Congress of UNESCO Biosphere Reserves held in Lima, Peru in March 2016, and its most important outcome, the Lima Action Plan, which is providing new strategic guidance to the biosphere reserves. The worldwide network of biosphere reserves goes back to the 1970s following the so-called Biosphere Conference, which led to the development of these special areas that shall be model regions for sustainable development and living labs for conservation and, well, providing benefits to human well-being. In the 1970s, the first biosphere reserves were established and tested and evolved conceptually, and there was a substantial milestone in the 1990s with the Seville strategy, which led to the modernization of the concept of biosphere reserves, also coming up with stricter criteria for the adoption and exclusion of biosphere reserves from this network. So with the whole process becoming more ambitious, clearly there is a regular update of the strategies and the revision of the accomplishments. And in this process, the Lima Congress now has become another very important milestone, held in a megacity, in a desert, a very unlikely location, possibly for, well, a meeting on nature conservation, but very much appropriate in the context of the challenges to sustainable human development. So in a modern building, more than 1,000 representatives of governments and biosphere reserves and local communities, NGOs, academia and others convened, representing 115 countries. And apart from negotiating the overall strategy, there was a huge program of side events and presentations and events that facilitated exchange between the biosphere reserves. The political process ended with adopting the Lima Declaration and the new 10 years plan, which is briefly called the Lima Action Plan, and which especially encourages biosphere reserves to contribute actively to the agenda of sustainable development as conceptualized by the Sustainable Development Goals and other multilateral targets. And this clearly represents a very important update of the Biosphere Reserves mission. The Lima Declaration on the network very specifically addresses the conventions such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, with corresponding agreements such as the Paris Agreement on Climate Change from 2015, and especially the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, also endorsed in 2015, seen as a new global framework and updated and comprehensive framework for promoting the cooperation of the biosphere reserves. Actually, the declaration is summarizing and remembering the strategic process, and also makes clear the progress that led now to the Lima Action Plan, with the biosphere reserves evolving not in isolation, but of course in the context of the wider environment of environmental policy. So biosphere reserves now shall be models, not just for sustainable development locally and areas that provide conservation and support livelihoods, but shall do this in tight relation to the National Agenda 21 programs and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Amongst others, the declaration foresees also the building of new partnerships, especially mentioning scientific institutions. And well, all this is made more operational, and it was brought down in the format of a project planning matrix virtually, which is representing the concrete Lima Action Plan for UNESCO's Man the Biosphere Programme and the World Network of Biosphere Reserves. So this plan is structured according to strategic action areas, and then mentions outcomes, concrete actions that contribute to the outcomes, and then the outputs are mentioned, as well as the responsibility, the time range, and the performance indicators. The first action area is referring to, well, the key role of biosphere reserves being models for sustainable development that shall effectively function. And the corresponding outcomes refer to biosphere reserves that are recognized as models that directly implement the bilateral environmental agreements and the sustainable development goals. It stresses the importance of the open and participatory selection, planning and implementation of the biosphere reserves, which is another important focus. Humans are in the focus, and the biosphere reserves that shall not exist in isolation, but be integrated into relevant legislation and national policies, which is of course necessary to function. Research, practical learning and training opportunities are another outcome that would support the management of the biosphere reserve and the effective delivery of its outputs. Clearly, financial sustainability is relevant in this context, and well, the network as such, with its statutory framework, which includes an adaptive management, regular and periodic review of the effectiveness of the areas, and then the adaptation of strategies if need be. And also a new topic is referring to the ecosystem services that are provided by the ecosystems within the biosphere reserves. In a nutshell, biosphere reserves still, of course, are envisioned as learning model sites, where it's about the ecosystems which provide the basis for the people, but they are pretty much people-centered, where people and stakeholders matter, and where practical and participatory action would lead to effectiveness and compliance with the overall strategy. The strategic action area B is referring to another key concept of the network of the biosphere reserves. It's about cooperation, collaboration, networking. For example, referring to the managers and engaged stakeholders of the biosphere reserves, but also to networks between biosphere reserves, regional and thematic networks, and of course networks which then shall have adequate resources for their work. The collaboration on these levels shall be supported, as well as the visibility of these networks and their activities necessarily. A special type of network, also going back to earlier stages of the development of the World Network, is the transnational and transboundary cooperation. There is both the concept of transboundary cooperation, often in the context of peace building, as much as the transnational cooperation, which can include also models of twinning, biosphere reserves, which work with similar ecosystems, can cooperate even if they work on different continents. And a special goal refers to the designation and implementation of transboundary biosphere reserves, which would be the ultimate level of intensive cooperation across borders. And then, the network of biosphere reserves shall be supported also by an interdisciplinary, active and open network of scientists and knowledge holders that would share the vision and mission of the Man in the Biosphere program. The Strategic Action Area C is dedicated to the effective external partnerships and sufficient and sustainable funding for the program and the World Network, which includes the recognition of the Man and Biosphere program as a key partner within UNESCO and other multilateral agreements, and would also reach out to private investors, entrepreneurs, and social enterprises that contribute to biosphere reserves activities. The Strategic Action Area D is all about communication, information, and data sharing and management, guaranteeing a full availability of all relevant documents and an increased awareness of the relevance of the program, to be achieved by a broader engagement and outreach. The Strategic Action Area E is of internal nature and targets a good governance of the program and within the program and the network, with specific regulations and provisions for transdisciplinary membership in committees or the functioning of thematic networks, the progress reporting and monitoring.